Purely by accident, I happen to have my two favorite mid-size crossovers in my driveway at the same time. This is the recently refreshed Hyundai Santa Fe, and lurking right behind it is the is it a station wagon, is it a crossover Subaru Outback. What's different about these two crossovers versus most mid-size SUVs or CUVs, whatever you want to call them, is their price tag starts awfully low, around $27,000. Exactly $27,000 for this, just under for the Subaru Outback. That puts them right in the middle, if not actually at the bottom of the pricing ladder for some of the compact crossovers that you might want to be cross-shopping against these. That's because unlike the Honda Passport or the Nissan Murano, these vehicles start with naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engines under the hood. So the drivetrain in the base model is pretty similar to what we find in the average compact crossover. But you get a bigger vehicle with a bigger cargo area, more room inside, a better finished interior, and I think a more premium experience all around. So let's do this a little bit differently. I'm just going to go ahead and grab the camera because unfortunately my videographer is not able to help me today. And let's just take a look around these two SUVs. Up front, you can see we have the redesigned nose in the Santa Fe. This has been a little bit controversial in some circles, but I think it's really growing on me. The grille is very, very expressive. It also is very 3D, as you can see. Then we have the LED headlights over here, and then they're bisected by this really T-shaped accent strip that runs right there down the front. No fog lights down below, but we do have parking sensors in this particular trim. The Santa Fe is much more of a traditional SUV or crossover shape. It has the big box profile right back there. I'm not a big fan of these wheels. Let me know what you think about those down there in the comment section below. Some Subaru fans object to calling the Outback a wagon, but remember that front doors forward, this basically is a Subaru Legacy. They've just lifted this particular model up to 9.5 inches. This is the new Subaru Outback Wilderness. There are a bunch of factors when it comes to off-road ability in a vehicle. Ground clearance is very important, as are the tires. This has a good combination of that. We have 9.5 inches of ground clearance, which is a ton of clearance, way more than we find over there in the Santa Fe. And this model has Yokohama Geolandar all-terrain tires. This is the first Subaru to have all-terrains right from the factory. Subaru says that a lot of people were modifying their vehicle aftermarket, so they decided to just go ahead and give a more rugged package right from the factory. We also have improved skid plates and a more aggressive final axle ratio. You can see back here, the rear end design is definitely very SUV, very crossover, although you can definitely see the relationship between this and the Subaru Legacy as well. Moving back over to the Santa Fe, this particular model is the hybrid version, but it does have a mechanical all-wheel drive system, so this is going to be a bit more capable in terms of off-roading than something like a RAV4 hybrid. Down below, no visible exhaust tips. They're tucked up right there under the bumper. Let me know what you think about the look of these two options down there in the comment section. I think I give the slight win to the Santa Fe. This particular design has grown on me. I really love the grille design. The headlights being divorced from the accent lights, I'm not the biggest fan of that still, but I think this design works better than what Hyundai has done in the Kona. It's better integrated with the grille and the entire front end. I also like the fact that this top end of the T-shape turns into the turn signal. You'll see that blinking over there on that side. Subaru, on the other hand, has gone for more of a rugged look with a lot of black plastic cladding. If you do plan on taking your vehicle a little further off the beaten path, these panels are going to be less expensive to repair than a body-colored panel. But because this is essentially a Subaru Legacy wagon, if you did prefer the look that you find in the Legacy, you could replace the front end with the components from that Legacy sedan. Since this is the Wilderness trim, we have gold accents all the way around the vehicle. Those denote either recovery points like we find up front for the recovery hook, or tie-down points for the roof rack. Speaking of roofs and roof racks, the shape of the Santa Fe is very traditional SUV or crossover. We have a very boxy profile, a pretty high roof line. You can see that this roof line, if I stand right next to the vehicle, is just about here on me. The Outback, on the other hand, has a roof line several inches lower, even though this has 9.5 inches of ground clearance, which is considerably more than we find in the Santa Fe. I think that's the reason the Outback has become so popular with outdoorsy people. If you want to put a Thule on top, or bicycles, or a kayak, or skis, or whatever, it's going to be an awful lot easier to get them on and off the vehicle when the roof line is closer to the ground. Subaru would also like you to know that this vehicle is one of the few that has a rated roof tent load on the specification sheet. Theoretically, you could put a roof tent on pretty much any SUV or crossover out there as long as you were within the static roof load rating. However, Subaru actually gives us a specification, so you can be a little bit more comfortable about that fitment. Both vehicles feature a decent amount of driver assistance technology standard, but you'll find a bit more on the base model of Santa Fe than on the base model of Outback. That's quite logical because the Outback has standard all-wheel drive, and the cost of that had to come from somewhere. So obviously, designing a new vehicle and feature contenting it, for lack of a better phrase, is a little bit tricky, so there are always going to be pros and cons for the standard features that you find in each vehicle. If you want standard all-wheel drive, that's going to be this one. If you want a bit more feature content in your base vehicle, that would be the Santa Fe. The two systems also operate a little bit differently. The Santa Fe uses a radar sensor for its adaptive cruise control system and its pedestrian detection system, etc. This one relies entirely on two cameras behind the windshield. There are pros and cons to each system. If the vision of this system is impacted by a foggy windshield or an icy windshield, etc., the system is not going to function properly. On the other hand, it's less expensive to design, less expensive to build, and less expensive to repair. If you're involved in a minor fender bender, or if you decide to put a brush guard on the front of your Outback, it's not going to impact the way that the Subaru eyesight system functions, because it's looking from up here at the road in front. The Santa Fe, on the other hand, is going to perform a little bit better in fog and some adverse weather conditions. However, keep in mind that if it's snowing really heavily, a radar sensor is not going to be able to see through that either. And then if you get involved in a minor fender bender, the radar sensor in this is going to be a bit more expensive to repair. Under the hood, these two vehicles could not be more different if they had tried. Under this hood, we find either a naturally aspirated or a turbocharged boxer engine. Other than Subaru, really the only other user of boxer engines in production vehicles right now is Porsche. And the drivetrain design in this vehicle is an awful lot closer to Audi's classic Quattro system. This is a longitudinal engine design like you'd typically find in a rear-wheel drive vehicle, meaning that the transmission lives somewhere about here in the vehicle. It actually extends under the center console. Subaru's all-wheel drive system is integrated into the transmission case, making packaging neat and tidy, but it does result in a little bit more weight being sent to the front of the vehicle. The front axle is right about here. The entire engine lives in front of the front axle. Two important things to know about the Outback are that all-wheel drive is standard across the line, as we see in every Subaru except for the BRZ. So if you're looking for a relatively inexpensive vehicle with high fuel economy and all-wheel drive, the Subaru is definitely for you. On the other hand, CVTs are also standard. It's the only transmission offered in the Outback. So if you're not a fan of continuously variable automatics, you might want to look elsewhere. Under the Santa Fe's hood, we find three different engines. The base engine is a naturally aspirated 2.5-liter four-cylinder engine that produces power very similar to the average compact crossover. We then have a 2.5-liter turbo engine, which is one of the more powerful engines in this segment, producing over 300 pound-feet of torque. That's mated to an interesting 8-speed dual-clutch transmission. Essentially, they've borrowed that drivetrain out of the Hyundai Sonata N-Line. That drivetrain is a ton of fun. Then we have this one, which is somewhat unique. This is a 1.6-liter turbocharged hybrid. This will give you over 30 miles per gallon. There are two different fuel economy ratings depending on the trim level you get. And what's also interesting about this is that it's mated to a 6-speed automatic transmission. So if you're looking for a hybrid that delivers almost 35 miles per gallon in real-world driving, and you want it to feel like a traditional small turbocharged engine with an automatic transmission, this is the vehicle for you, because that's exactly what's going on under the hood. Coming a little bit later this year, the Santa Fe will also offer a plug-in hybrid system with the same basic drivetrain, a bigger electric motor to give you a bit more oomph, and a bigger battery pack to give you about 30 miles of EV range. When it comes to cargo capacity, the Santa Fe wins the race here. It has a much larger cargo area. It also is a few inches taller. So if you're putting tall items in your cargo area, keep that in mind. Then there is a lot of additional underfloor storage space. I could take this out. We then have this foam divider here, which can be removed from the vehicle as well. And then you can put a large amount of cargo right back there undivided if you want to. This cargo area is so deep that some roller-style bags may actually fit under the load floor. And if you want even more cargo room, the second row seats slide forward and backward, a little bit unusual for a two-row crossover, giving you even more cargo area right back there. Now, if you're wondering why is the load floor so high, that's because right back here we do find what I think is a little bit of a design misstep. This is where they put the battery for the vehicle. This is a 12-volt battery right under there. And then, of course, the jack, tire iron, etc. That's right over there. If these had been located somewhere else, then you'd have a positively cavernous cargo area right there under the load floor, but as it is, this area is definitely more practical than what we find in the Outback. And in case you're wondering, yes, there is a spare tire. It's a temporary spare. It's positioned right there under that battery, right next to the exhaust. Moving over to the Subaru, we find a power hatch right back here. On the inside, rubber floor mats, and because this is the Wilderness model, the seat backs also get kind of a rubbery texture on them that makes it a little bit more durable as far as putting cargo back there. We have a roller style cargo cover with some extra notches right there so that we can lift up out of the way, levers to fold those rear seat backs. They do not slide forward and backward, however. Going for a dive under the load floor, we find a little bit of additional storage space and a full-size spare tire. This is the same Geolander all-terrain tire that we find on the outside. So if you're looking for a full-size spare, this might be the better option. But as with every design, there are pros and cons, and the cons with this particular profile is that the cargo area is a little bit shorter in height. The distance from that top opening right down there to the load floor is a few inches smaller than what we see in the Santa Fe, even though over in the Santa Fe, we have that hatch is a little bit higher off the ground because the spare tire is under the vehicle. In general terms, I find the seats of both vehicles pretty comfortable, but the seats in the Santa Fe are a little bit more adjustable. You should also know that the seating position in the Outback is definitely more sedan-like, and that makes sense because the seat frames, the steering wheel, the dashboard, etc., all of this is borrowed out of the Legacy sedan. So you're sitting in the vehicle in exactly the same way, with your legs sticking out a little bit further in front of you, a little bit more of a reclined seating position. But because this vehicle has so much ground clearance, you'll find that your eye line is actually just about as high off the ground as the average other crossover that has more of an upright sitting position. So it really is more of a matter of personal preference. I have a lot of headroom here. I have about 4 inches of headroom with the seat all the way at the bottom. We don't have a 4-way lumbar support, however. I do think that's a bit of a misstep. Over in the Santa Fe, you'll definitely notice the more upright seating position. The seat also has a 4-way adjustable lumbar support and a power extending thigh cushion because this is essentially the upper end trim of the Santa Fe. We have a tilt telescopic steering column with a little bit less motion than we find in the Outback. If I were simply picking between these two vehicles based on seat comfort, the Santa Fe here would take the nod. When it comes to rear seat room, both vehicles do very well, but the Santa Fe has an absolutely enormous back seat. And thanks to the design of this vehicle, a nearly flat load floor. It's not exactly flat. There's a hump of perhaps about ½ inch right there in the center. Unlike some Toyota and Honda hybrids, Hyundai has not located the battery pack under the seat or in the rear passenger area. In the hybrid model, it actually lives under the passenger seat up front. If you get the plug-in hybrid model, then the battery pack is across the vehicle right there under the front seat. So it doesn't really impact rear seat room much at all. There is a slight impact. You'll notice that on the chart on the side of your screen, but it's not a big deal because the Santa Fe has an absolutely enormous amount of room already. The seats also have a pretty aggressive recline function. These seats recline about 3 or 4 inches. Hopping into the Outback's back seat, the first thing you'll notice is how much further away the dashboard is. That's because of how long the Outback is inside. The more reclined seating position means that you're stretched out a little bit further from that dashboard right back here in the back seats. We do have a back seat recline mechanism. That's the handle for it right over there, right next to the shoulder belt. And of course, the seats fold in a 60-40 fashion. But you'll also notice that due to the design of the vehicle's drivetrain, we have a much larger hump right back here in the back of the Outback. With the interior design, Subaru is definitely focused on rugged touches. We find little Outback Wilderness logos right there on the door. They look kind of like a t-shirt tag. These seats are not leather, they're imitation leather because it's a little bit more durable, and we have some interesting texturing going on here. It kind of reminds me of a golf ball. Seat bolstering isn't terribly aggressive. The dashboard is again shared with the Subaru Legacy, so this definitely has a bit more of a passenger car or sedan-like vibe, especially with the way the windshield is angled right there. It makes the dashboard a little bit longer than some crossovers. Here in the middle of the dash, we have a very large touchscreen infotainment system. This system is not technically standard in the Outback, but you will find this on almost every Outback on the dealer lots because really only the base trim of the Outback gets a smaller 2-screen setup. I'm really surprised that Subaru bothered to give us 2 different infotainment systems and make that smaller one only available in the base model. There's a pretty standard console shifter right there, 2 large cup holders, softly padded armrest. The storage area inside is not as large as some because remember the transmission lives under here in the vehicle. Then moving over to the driver's side, we have a pretty traditional instrument cluster, 2 physical dials, a small LCD right there in the middle, gold accent rings, of course, because this is the Wilderness trim, and then the same steering wheel that we find in a variety of different Subaru models, again, gold accent there at the bottom. The look inside the Santa Fe is definitely very modern crossover. We have a much less bulky module right here behind the rearview mirror because this does not use a dual camera setup like we find in the Subaru. Instead, it uses a radar sensor for adaptive cruise control. So it sort of debulks the interior, but there are obviously pros and cons. We'll talk about that in a bit. We have a large panoramic moonroof in this particular trim. A moonroof is available in the Outback. That particular trim does not have one, but it's not going to be a panoramic design like this one. High adjustable shoulder belts. This has a 2-tone brown leather interior, so this is actually dark and light brown. The dashboard design is definitely a bit more modern Hyundai crossover. We have this infotainment system perched on the dashboard. This is a little bit smaller than the one that we find in the Outback, and this is optional on upper end trims. So most of the trims that you find on dealer lots will probably going to be evenly split between the smaller 8-inch screen and the one that's in this model. It's a 10.25-inch screen. This has a sort of symmetrical dashboard design, and then over here in front of the driver we have a standard 12.3-inch instrument cluster. I am a little bit torn, but I have to say that if I were choosing between a standard large LCD like this or a standard larger touchscreen infotainment system, I would probably take the larger touchscreen infotainment system and have that be optional. But it does have a really great look in this cabin. We have a pretty typical Hyundai steering wheel here, paddle shifters on the back, and then it looks like every button that has been purged out of other vehicles has found a home right here in the center console. This reminds me a lot of the Hyundai Nexo. Tons of climate control buttons there, so if you're the kind of person that likes physical buttons rather than touchscreen interaction for climate control, this is going to be a good option. Also some direct access buttons for the media there. This rotary knob controls the drive modes. It also has a commandable lock of the center coupling, which is interestingly something that we do not get in the Outback. Instead, in the Outback, it simply has drive modes like you would select right around here, snow, smart, etc., but you cannot command a lock of the center coupling. Below that control, we have heated and ventilated seats, auto brake hold, a push button shifter design. This little cover covers that single cup holder there and the USB input. There's another cup holder back here, Qi wireless charging slot for your smartphone, and then a center console that opens right like that. This is deeper than the one that we find in the Outback because the transmission is not located under here, it's located entirely under the hood. And that's why when we look behind the center console, that driveline hump right back there between the rear seat footwells is only about a ½ inch high. Out on the road, the Santa Fe and the Outback are pretty evenly matched when it comes to metrics, but they definitely have distinctly different feels. The base engines deliver performance that is shockingly similar, as do the up-level turbocharged engines. You'll get 6.2 to 6.3 seconds if you get the top-level turbocharged engine in either the Outback or the Santa Fe, but the feel could not be more different if they had tried. We get continuously variable automatic transmissions in the Subaru Outback, whether we're talking about the base engine or the turbo engine or the Wilderness. We get a variety of different transmissions in the Santa Fe, an 8-speed automatic, a 6-speed automatic hybrid, or an 8-speed dual-clutch transmission. And there are certainly pros and cons to any of these transmission technologies. The 8-speed automatic in the Santa Fe is certainly going to feel the most conventional, as would the hybrid system with a little bit of a hybrid twist. The CVT is not exactly my cup of tea as far as my favorite drivetrains go, but I could see logical reasons that people might be interested in it over a dual-clutch transmission like we find in the top-end Santa Fe. If you do plan on taking your vehicle a little bit more off the beaten path, the 8-speed automatic transmission in the Santa Fe's base trim is going to have a little bit of an edge, in my opinion, over what we see in the base Subaru Outback. It retains a torque converter. But if we're talking about a little bit more rugged situations, know that the dual clutch transmission does not have a torque converter. So it's going to have to slip that clutch like a manual transmission would to get up and over some of those more complicated obstacles. The CVT that we find in the Subaru Outback's top-end turbo trims can also seem to give up the ghost a little bit when the going gets rough, but it is going to be smoother in those off-road crawl situations. Neither one of these vehicles is overtly a rugged off-road vehicle. Even the Subaru Outback Wilderness with all of its extra body cladding. It's simply designed to take you further than a regular Subaru would go. If you want to go rock crawling, if you want to go to Moab and tackle some really steep adventures or slick adventures, etc., you're going to want a vehicle like a Jeep Grand Cherokee or something with locking differentials and locking axles, features that neither of these vehicles has. You can command a lock of the Santa Fe's center coupling, and that does seem like it's going to be a little bit more sure-footed in some situations than the system that we find in the Outback, but the Outback has a lot of ground clearance, it has a soft and compliant suspension, so it's going to be pretty comfortable on those longer gravel roads. I was recently out in Utah driving the Nissan Frontier, and that has a very pickup truck style suspension, something that you'd expect in a more rugged off-road vehicle. To be perfectly honest, when you look at that video, I could have done that entire trip absolutely no problem in the Subaru Outback, and the Outback would have been a great deal more comfortable than that Nissan Frontier, simply based on the suspension design. When it comes to handling ability, the two vehicles are also very evenly matched, but again, they feel a bit different. The Subaru has a decent amount of body roll, but because the center of gravity is lower, the handling feel is more car-like, more sedan-like, if that's something that you're interested in. And of course, the seating position is more sedan-like as well. You're sitting in a more relaxed position, the dashboard stretches out further in front of you, it has that long hood profile, and the Santa Fe definitely feels more like a traditional SUV. Thanks to the tire choices and the suspension design, the ride quality win goes to the Outback. This is certainly going to be more comfortable if you spend a lot of time on rough gravel roads. When it comes to cabin quietness, however, the Santa Fe appears to be a little bit quieter than the Subaru. When I was able to test these two vehicles back to back, I got 1 decibel quieter inside the cabin of the Santa Fe. As far as fuel economy goes, it's a bit of a mixed bag. These two vehicles are well matched, but you get 29 to 26 miles per gallon in the regular versions of the Outback, 24 if you choose the Outback Wilderness because of the gear ratios. In the Santa Fe, all versions of the non-hybrid are going to be 24 mpg. So all versions of that model are going to be as low as the lowest version of the Subaru. That's thanks to the CVT and just the way that Subaru has designed the engine and transmission combination. Now, if you want the best fuel economy, that would be in the Santa Fe hybrid. That will get you 32 to 34 miles per gallon, leapfrogging what we find in the Subaru. With that out of the way, let's talk about pricing. The two vehicles are pretty close together, but they go about their base models a little bit differently. The Subaru starts at $26,945, as I said earlier. For 2022, the Santa Fe starts at $27,200. But as I mentioned in this video, you will find more standard equipment on the Santa Fe. You just won't find standard all-wheel drive, and that is one of the key advantages to the Outback. If you're shopping for a RAV4, CRV, Tucson, or Equinox, you could get a Subaru Outback for about the same price, have about the same performance, but have standard all-wheel drive and a larger and more comfortable interior. The same thing could really be said about the Santa Fe too, although without that all-wheel drive component, you'd find a bit more feature content, a lot more room, but if you add all-wheel drive, it's going to be just a hair more expensive than some of those compact crossover competitors. On the downside, there's no hybrid Outback at the moment. Value is the best in the Outback in the lower end trims. So if we're talking about the base model, the next step up in the lineup, value is excellent there, especially again when you compare it to compact crossovers. But by the time you start taking a look at the Subaru Outback Wilderness or some of the upper level trims, you'll find more premium features and more premium fit and finish options inside the Santa Fe, but you'll pay about the same price as the Outback. You'll also find a longer standard warranty in the Santa Fe and higher reliability according to most metrics. According to Consumer Reports, the Santa Fe is a full step above the Outback in terms of reliability, and we have seen some issues with some of Subaru's engines and transmissions over the last few years. Hopefully they've resolved that in the Outback, but that predicted reliability metric is still there, so you should logically expect the Santa Fe to be a little bit more reliable. The Santa Fe is also a little bit roomier depending on the dimension that you're looking at. Again, it depends on how you value that more relaxed, more reclined driving position in the Outback, because measuring from the dashboard all the way back to the cargo area in the rear, that dimension is a little bit longer in the Outback because of its general design, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you get more room. We actually have 3 inches more combined legroom in the Santa Fe and about 4 cubic feet more cargo capacity, thanks to the squarer profile. You can also expand that out a little bit in the Santa Fe by taking out the foam divider, and if you scooted the second row seats 3 inches forward, you'd have the same kind of legroom that we find in the Subaru, but even more cargo space behind. Bottom line, both of these vehicles are excellent mid-size crossovers and excellent values when compared against mid-level and even base-level trims of the average compact crossover out there. If I were shopping for a RAV4, a CRV, a Tucson, or anything in the compact crossover category, I would definitely put the Outback and the Santa Fe on your shopping list because they're going to give you a roomier interior, a more premium interior, and a more premium badge, honestly, on the outside than something like the RAV4 and CRV. I also think that the styling is a little bit more attractive than the average compact crossover. Versus the average compact crossover, you're going to give up a little bit of fuel economy in the Santa Fe, but honestly, you won't give up really anything at all in the Subaru Outback. And of course, if you're worried about fuel economy, there's the hybrid Santa Fe, which is an excellent option as well. These are definitely my 2 top picks for anybody out there shopping for a crossover that's easy to park, has a little bit more room, and has an excellent value proposition. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section, and what would you pick if you were shopping? I suspect I would lean generally a little bit towards the Santa Fe, but there are definitely logical reasons that you might want to get the Subaru Outback instead. Let me know what you think about that as well. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Instagram, Twitter, all those other social places. Check out the new TikTok channel. I'm attempting to do that at this moment. You can also check out AlexNautos.com. It's had a complete redesign for the website, and hopefully there'll be some new exclusive website content coming soon there. I'll see all of you later.